There is one single battle that changed the course of the Pacific War. Because of this battle, the Japanese imperialism that had been so dominant began to walk the path of downfall. Japan, which had previously overwhelmed the US with its immense power, started to fall into ruin because of just one battle. How did this happen? Behind it were unexpected coincidences and the US military's meticulous operation. Let me now read you that hidden story. Before the Battle of Midway, comparing the military powers of Japan and the United States, the Japanese forces were overwhelming. First of all, Japan had the upper hand in aircraft carriers by a margin of 11-4. Not only that, but Japan had the upper hand in almost everything. For example, there's something called the integrated tactical capability to operate aircraft carriers, and even in that area the Japanese military had the advantage. An aircraft carrier cannot be judged just by the number of ships. An aircraft carrier includes escort fleets, transport fleets, and even submarines. So one aircraft carrier isn't just one ship, it's literally a whole fleet. Because they operate as independent fleets, it's very difficult for aircraft carriers to conduct joint operations. So normally you form a carrier task force with 1 or 2 carriers and conduct independent operations. But the Japanese military showed an incredible ability to integrate these carrier task forces and operate them as a single battle group. That was, in fact, something Japan developed for the first time. And the first successful case of that was Pearl Harbor. To take such a massive carrier task force across the Pacific without being detected and to launch a coordinated surprise attack, that success was, in a way, an incredible event in the history of modern warfare. In terms of battleship power too, the Japanese military had the upper hand. The world's largest and most powerful battleship at the time, Yamato, was deployed in the Battle of Midway. In the Pacific War, naval battles shifted to carrier-centered warfare. Carrier-centered warfare meant that the aircraft launched from carriers flew out and engaged in aerial combat. That became the main type of naval battle. The aircraft responsible for that were usually divided into 3 types: fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers. In terms of fighters and torpedo bombers, the Japanese military had overwhelmingly superior performance. At the time, the US military's main fighter was the Wildcat, and the Japanese had the Zero. When the two faced off, people would say, "If you get into a turning fight with a Zero, you'll die 100%. That's what both witnesses and survivors said. It was that certain how superior the Zero was. The only aircraft that the US had that could surpass the Japanese were the SBD Dauntless Dive Bomber and the Catalina reconnaissance plane, which had one of the best operational ranges in the world. Just because aircraft are good doesn't mean you win in aerial combat. Aerial tactics and pilot skill are extremely important. To be honest, the skill level of US pilots was terrible. Most of them were teenagers and beginners. Japanese pilots, not just in fighters but also in torpedo bombers and dive bombers, were considered the best in the world at the time. The Japanese military had already gained extensive combat experience in the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War. In aerial tactics as well, Japan was overwhelmingly advanced. On aircraft carriers, torpedo bombers, fighters, and dive bombers usually take off together as one team. For the US Navy, these 3 units would take off as a group from a single carrier. So it took quite a bit of time for all of them to get airborne. For example, if the fighters took off first, they had to wait in the air until the dive bombers caught up. While waiting in the sky, they would burn a lot of fuel. So while all of them were getting airborne and assembling, they would circle in the air for over 30 minutes before heading out as a group. Just the preparation time to launch a coordinated attack on an enemy ship took an hour or even 2, with huge fuel consumption. But how did the Japanese do it while operating their carriers in an integrated way? Fighters took off from carrier number 1, torpedo bombers from number 2, and dive bombers from number 3. Then they would head to a predetermined rendezvous point and form a single attack formation in the air. It is said that this process took only 7 to 10 minutes. How important is this? If carrier task forces spotted each other on the horizon and launched attack aircraft at the same time, then before the US attack planes even finished forming up, Japanese planes would already be attacking and sinking their carriers. It was a huge difference in capability. Now, hearing this, 2 questions naturally arise. First, with such overwhelming power, why did Japan lose? Second, why did Japan, with this overwhelming force, attack Midway, just a worthless coral island in the Pacific? The Japanese military never once considered attacking the US mainland. They were already having a hard enough time fighting China, and the idea of also fighting the US was unthinkable. However, they felt that they needed to secure the Pacific. They hoped the US wouldn't come, and if they did come, they wanted to hurt them enough to force a ceasefire and secure dominance in the Pacific. That's why they carried out the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. But at Pearl Harbor, they didn't manage to sink a single aircraft carrier. As a result, the Japanese High Command fell into an emotional panic. They had provoked the United States but failed to achieve anything decisive. Then, Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the Navy, came up with a new plan to once again capture the US aircraft carriers. Since the previous surprise attack had failed, he thought, why not go ahead and occupy Hawaii altogether? The idea was that this would block the US Pacific Fleet. Upon hearing this, the Naval Ministry and the Army raised a huge uproar. This was because Japan had entered the war with limited resources, and if they tried to occupy Hawaii, they wouldn't have the transport ships needed to maintain supply lines that far. Even if they gathered everything they had, they would only be capable of short-term operations. So Yamamoto revised the plan. Instead of attacking Pearl Harbor directly, he devised an operation to lure the US aircraft carriers out and destroy them. But where would they lure them to? That's when Midway came into view. Midway is quite far from Hawaii, but it's essentially the best forward outpost stretching into the Pacific. In any case, since it was US territory, they thought that occupying it would bring out the US carriers. Then the Japanese would quickly take Midway, hide their carriers nearby in ambush, and use planes launched from both land and carriers to sink the American carriers. That was the plan. Of course, even this plan faced opposition from the Army and the Navy High Command in the Imperial General Headquarters. They gave various reasons. At this point, when Yamamoto could no longer overcome the opposition, a miracle happened. The United States formed a special unit called the Doolittle Raid and bombed Japan. In terms of military results, the Doolittle Raid didn't amount to much. They just dropped a few bombs and left, but the Japanese leadership was shocked. The Emperor's Land had been bombed. The mainland, which they had believed would never be attacked by the US, had been struck. Suddenly, even the army changed its stance, saying, "We'll support you, let's go to Midway, just as you said." In this way, the atmosphere shifted drastically, and the Midway operation got the green light. The key to the Battle of Midway was surprise. But from the very beginning, Japan's Midway operation was full of incomprehensible mistakes. The most critical of these was the dispersal of their forces. Originally, the Japanese planned to use 8 of their 11 aircraft carriers in the operation. That would have been overwhelming firepower. But then, things started to go strangely, and 2 of the carriers were suddenly sent to an operation in the Aleutian Islands. This was a completely separate operation unrelated to Midway, but Japan carried out the 2 operations simultaneously. Even so, 6 carriers were supposed to head to Midway, but then 2 were unnecessarily sent to the Battle of the Coral Sea. There, both of those carriers were damaged and could no longer participate in the operation. In the end, only 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, were sent to Midway. The Battle of the Coral Sea left behind another mistake. At the time, 2 US carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, participated in the battle. Lexington was sunk and Yorktown was heavily damaged. However, the Japanese believed that both had been sunk, so they thought, we still have 4 carriers and the enemy has at most 2 left. Besides, the carrier task force that fought in the Coral Sea was considered the least combat capable in the US Navy. Even in a 2-to-2 situation, we won. So if our strongest 1st and 2nd carrier divisions go to Midway, victory will come easily. But the United States was not that easy to deal with. The damaged Yorktown from the Coral Sea was quickly repaired and deployed to Midway. However, as mentioned earlier, the Japanese still believed Yorktown had been sunk in the Coral Sea. So they calculated the US had at most 2 operational carriers. Even if by some chance both sides had equal strength, they believed their own pilots and combat experience were far superior, so they didn't consider the US a serious threat. They were convinced they could overwhelmingly capture Midway. But war always demands that you consider even the slimmest of possibilities. For example, if a lion is hunting a rabbit, it shouldn't think, "This is too easy, I'll hop on one leg out of embarrassment." That kind of thinking is unacceptable. This is a basic principle of tactics, and it was here that the Japanese made their final mistake. All wars begin with a war game, a kind of simulation before actual combat. The officers assigned to play the role of the US forces took it very seriously. They faithfully reenacted the exact tactics the US Navy would later use in the real Battle of Midway. And when the war game was played out, it produced the same result as the actual battle. At that point, they should have changed the operation. but instead they insisted, "That can't be. The Americans aren't that smart. They're idiots, so there's no way they'd fight like that." They forcefully overruled the simulation results and changed the outcome. Admiral Yamamoto was actually present during this. This moment became a critical stain on his reputation. For reasons unknown, he ended up supporting the Midway Strike Force, and with that, the Japanese military stepped onto the path of destiny. From this point on, the Battle of Midway was decided in a matter of 5 or 10 minutes. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, the Japanese strike force took off to attack Midway. The Japanese plan was to first bomb the land base at Midway to neutralize its defenses and air power. Then the next day, ground forces would land and capture the island. Their idea was to turn Midway into a Japanese base, and after a few days, ambush and destroy the US carriers that would come to recapture it. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had attacked while the Americans were still asleep and managed to destroy their aircraft on the ground. But this time, the planes had already taken off, so they were bombing an empty base. Then something even more surprising happened. While Japanese carrier-based planes were en route to attack Midway, suddenly American aircraft appeared over the Japanese fleet. At 7:10 a.m., torpedo bombers launched from Midway began their attack on the Japanese fleet. Of course, the attack failed and the planes were shot down, but the Japanese were shocked because they had not expected an attack at all. If things had gone according to their plan, they would have bombed Midway while the defenders were still asleep and would not have been attacked in return. But here the enemy had come to strike them first. One of the unseen mistakes made by the Japanese at Midway was that they were still trapped in the memory of Pearl Harbor. But Pearl Harbor had succeeded because it was a perfect surprise attack. At Midway, however, the Americans already knew what was coming. The most decisive factor was that the US had a cryptography team that had broken Japanese radio codes. One of the key figures was Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, a code breaker who discovered an important clue in Japanese communications. He deciphered messages referring to a target labeled AF. Looking back through earlier intercepts from March, he found a Japanese message saying, "We are passing AF." That gave him a hint. There was only one island in the Pacific the Japanese could be referring to as AF, the Midway Atoll. It couldn't be Hawaii, so they deduced that AF must be Midway. But this wasn't enough proof. When Rochefort reported this to his superiors, they said, "That's not enough to be sure." So he set a trap. In order to get Japan to confirm that AF was Midway, Rochefort came up with a way to bait them into mentioning it. He arranged for a fake emergency report to be sent by radio from Hawaii. The message said that Midway's seawater desalination system had broken down and they were running out of fresh water. They knew Japanese signals intelligence would intercept this report, and that was the point. As expected, the Japanese intercepted the fake message and reported it back to their homeland using coded communications. AF is running out of fresh water. This confirmed that AF was indeed Midway, and the US became certain that a Japanese attack on the Midway Atoll was imminent. Thanks to the power of code breaking, the Americans were able to prepare for the Japanese attack and even plan a counter-ambush. Admiral Nagumo, who had no knowledge of the US breaking their codes, was caught completely off guard by the American counterattack. Initially, he had ordered half the aircraft on his carriers to be armed with bombs for attacking ships, and the other half with bombs for attacking land targets. But after the initial assault on Midway, he gave the order to switch the ship attack munitions to land attack bombs. Then, at 7:28 a.m., one of the Japanese scout planes finally spotted a US fleet. However, the radio transmission was garbled and failed to confirm whether any aircraft carriers were present. Chaos erupted in the Japanese command. Some officers reasoned that if a destroyer was sighted in that area, a carrier must be nearby. It couldn't be just a lone escort. Still, without clear confirmation, they couldn't commit the remaining half of the planes. Meanwhile, the Japanese still needed to continue their attacks on Midway, and the situation was becoming increasingly complex. In this state of confusion and hesitation, the bomb rearming process for another strike on Midway continued. At 7:47 a.m., a second wave of American aircraft attacked. It included 16 dive bombers led by Marine Major Henderson and 15 B-26 bombers launched from Midway. They failed to land a single hit, and Henderson's squadron was completely wiped out. But just after this second wave, the Japanese scout plane finally reported confirmation. An American aircraft carrier had been sighted. Upon hearing this, Admiral Nagumo immediately reversed course. He ordered all aircraft to be rearmed once again, this time switching from land attack bombs back to ship attack torpedoes and bombs. However, this rearming process took at least an hour and a half, By the time all Japanese carriers were ready to launch a coordinated strike on the American fleet, it was already past 9 a.m. So what had the Americans been doing during all this time? While the Japanese hesitated and debated whether US carriers were really present, the Americans responded swiftly and decisively. The first wave of American attackers to appear were torpedo bombers launched from the USS Hornet. Torpedo bombers fly just above the sea surface and launch their torpedoes horizontally. This makes them extremely vulnerable to enemy fighters. As soon as American fighters engaged in dogfights, they were quickly overwhelmed by the superior Japanese Zeros. 2/3 of the torpedo bombers from the Hornet went off in the wrong direction, and Lieutenant Commander Waldron's entire squadron was wiped out. To make matters worse, they failed to locate the Japanese carriers, which were 280 kilometers away, and became disoriented in the air. At this point, they were in grave danger of running out of fuel. But then came a dramatic turn of events. Around 10:20 to 10:30 a.m., just as their fuel was about to run out, they spotted a Japanese warship on the ocean below the clouds. This ship had earlier broken off from the main fleet while pursuing an American submarine and was now heading back to rejoin the formation. Commander McCluskey reasoned that the ship must be returning to the main carrier group, so he followed it while staying hidden in the clouds. Sure enough, his group soon came upon the main Japanese fleet, with their aircraft carriers in plain sight. The Japanese forces at sea were already in disarray due to the sporadic American air attacks, and with low-hanging clouds covering the sky, they failed to notice the American dive bombers approaching. Dive bombers attack by diving almost vertically, and at that time, no anti-aircraft weapon could effectively target such steep attacks. Unlike modern times, where missiles can track aircraft, back then they relied solely on machine guns, making it nearly impossible to shoot down steep diving planes. This meant that dive bombers had to be intercepted before they reached their attack altitude, but in the chaos, the Japanese completely missed the chance. What followed was the infamous miracle of 5 minutes at Midway. Within just 5 minutes, American dive bombers scored direct hits on 3 Japanese aircraft carriers. The Soryu was hit by 3 bombs. The Kaga was struck repeatedly and quickly sank. Most devastating of all, the Akagi Admiral Nagumo's flagship was hit by a single bomb, but since its hangar was packed with torpedoes and bombs during the weapon switch process, that one bomb triggered a catastrophic explosion and led to its eventual sinking. Only the carrier Hiryu remained. It held out and managed to launch a retaliatory strike later that day, severely damaging the USS Yorktown, which would eventually sink. However, American aircraft from the other carriers launched a final counterattack and sank the Hiryu as well. With that, all 4 of Japan's elite aircraft carriers were lost to the Pacific. In addition, Japan lost 2 cruisers, over 250 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 personnel, including many of its highly trained pilots and technicians. The United States also suffered losses. The Yorktown was sunk, and 150 aircraft and 307 personnel were lost. But most of Yorktown's crew were rescued. Japan's loss wasn't just in hardware, it was the loss of irreplaceable human capital. The pilots, engineers, and flight deck crews they had spent years training were gone. This devastating blow to Japan's core strength would prove to be a turning point, severely weakening its military capability in the Pacific War moving forward.